The winter came with teeth. It chewed on the canvas of the teepees and stole the breath from your lungs. For Chayton, just 18 years old, this winter was the cruelest he had ever known. The land was a skeleton, picked clean. The government rations were a joke, rancid flour, spoiled lard. It was a slow poison that soured your soul. Sickness followed the hunger, a quiet ghost that moved from family to family, leaving a dry, rattling cough in its wake. Chayton felt the weight of his entire people on his shoulders. He was a boy, trapped in a world his grandfathers wouldn't even recognize, a world fenced in by invisible lines on a map, ruled by men he'd never seen. Every day was the same nightmare. Wake before the sun, search for game that wasn't there, and return home with empty hands and a hollow heart. He'd see the hope drain from his mother's eyes. He'd hear the ragged, shallow breathing of his little sister, Mesa, and a useless anger would burn in his chest. He was a hunter with nothing to hunt, a warrior with no war to fight. He built a wall around his heart, a quiet, stoic fortress to keep the desperation out. But inside, fear was eating him alive. Fear for Mesa. Her small body was wasting away, consumed by that relentless cough. He would have traded his own soul for a cure. He would have sold his future for a single piece of fresh meat. He whispered this prayer to the sky every night, a desperate bargain with the spirits. He didn't know an answer was already on its way, and it was worse than any prayer he could have imagined. The answer arrived on a tired horse in the form of Mr. Albright, the reservation agent. He was a man whose face looked like it was perpetually sucking on a lemon. His compassion was as thin as watered-down milk. He rode into their camp not with food, but with a proposition so strange, so deeply dishonorable, it felt like a punch to the gut. He spoke of a widow, Eleanor Vance, the woman who owned the massive V-Bar V ranch, the one whose lands bordered their own starving territory. Her husband, a man known for his brutality and his wealth, had died in the fall. He left her everything, an empire of cattle and grass. Albright laid out the terms like a man selling cattle. Eleanor Vance was 50 years old, childless, and her late husband's relatives from back east were circling like vultures. To secure her ranch, to hold it against their greed, the law said she needed a husband, a name on a piece of paper, a man in the house. She had heard of Chayton's family. She knew of their struggle, and she had made an offer. "She will marry you," Albright said, his eyes refusing to meet Chayton's. "You will live at the ranch house. You will want for nothing. In return, she will provide for your family, a steer every single week, sacks of flour, sugar, coffee, medicine from the doctor in Blackwood for your sister, blankets, more than you could ever dream of." The words dropped into the heavy silence of the teepee. Chayton's mother gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. His father's face turned to stone. Marry a white woman? A woman older than his own mother? It wasn't a marriage. It was a sale. He would be a pet, a thing to be paraded around when she needed him. His dignity, his spirit, his very name, traded for beef and blankets. Hot shame washed over him, so strong it nearly buckled his knees. He wanted to spit in Albright's face. He wanted to scream. But then he heard it. A small, wet cough from the corner of the teepee. Mesa. That sound cut right through his pride. It silenced the rage. He looked at his sister's face, pale and shiny with fever. He saw the raw desperation in his mother's eyes. What good was his honor if his sister died? What good was his pride if his family starved to death? It wasn't a choice at all. It was a cage, and the door had just slammed shut. "I will do it," he said, the words tasting like ash. He didn't look at his parents. He couldn't. He kept his eyes fixed on the dark corner where his sister was fighting for every single breath. He was laying his spirit down on an altar, a sacrifice to save his family. He thought he understood the price. He thought it was just his pride. He had no idea he was stepping into a world of secrets and sorrow, a place where the loneliness was a living thing, just as deep and consuming as his own. The ride to the V-Bar V was only a few miles, but it felt like crossing into another country. The land changed. The sparse, hungry reservation gave way to rolling hills of thick, golden grass that swayed like an ocean. The ranch house sat on a hill like a fortress, 2 stories of dark timber and river stone. Its windows were like dead eyes, staring out over the land it owned. It was a house built on power, and it made Chayton feel like a piece of driftwood washed ashore. He wasn't met by Eleanor Vance. He was met by a housekeeper named Martha, a stern, gray-haired woman whose lips were a flat line of disapproval. She led him through the house without a word. The silence inside was thick, oppressive. The air was cold, smelling of lemon oil and old sadness. Dark, heavy furniture stood like soldiers on polished wood floors. Portraits of grim-faced ancestors stared down from the walls, their painted eyes following him. It was the quietest place he had ever been, a tomb. His rooms were in a separate wing, bigger than his family's entire teepee. A soft bed, a dark wood wardrobe, a window that looked out over empty hills. It was a gilded cage. Martha informed him in a tone that was not an invitation, but an order, that Mrs. Vance would expect him for dinner at 6 o'clock. When the clock in the hall chimed the hour, he walked to the dining room. It was a long, cavernous space. A massive table could have seated 20 people, and at the far end, a solitary figure in a high-backed chair, Eleanor Vance. She was dressed in a severe black gown, her silver-streaked hair pulled back so tight it made her eyes seem stretched. Her face was a pale, neutral mask. He could see lines of grief etched around her eyes and mouth, but her expression gave nothing away. She wasn't the old crone he'd imagined, but there was no warmth in her. She was like the house itself, formidable, remote, and filled with a loneliness so deep you could feel it in the air. "Mr. Chayton," she said. Her voice was low and perfectly even. "Please, sit." She gestured to the chair at the opposite end of the table. The distance between them was a chasm, a physical reminder of the gulf between their worlds. He sat, his back ramrod straight. He felt clumsy, out of place. The meal was served by Martha in a suffocating silence. The only sound was the clink of silverware on fine china. He ate what was put in front of him, the rich food tasting foreign and strange. He kept his eyes down, but he could feel her gaze on him. It wasn't curious, it wasn't cruel. It was assessing, the way a rancher studies a new horse before buying it. The thought sent a fresh wave of shame through him. He was property. After the plates were cleared, she finally spoke about their arrangement. Her words were sharp and direct, stripped of all emotion. "This is a contract, Mr. Chayton. A business arrangement. You will want for nothing here. Your family will receive everything I promised. Your presence is required. You will act as the master of this house. When we have visitors, or when we go into town, you will be at my side. You will be my husband." She said the word husband like it was a legal term, completely hollow of any human meaning. "In all other matters, your time is your own. My life is my own. Is that understood?" "I understand," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "Good," she replied. For just a split second he saw something flicker in her eyes, a deep, profound weariness, and then the mask slipped back into place. She rose from her chair. "I am tired. Good night." And she was gone. She left him alone at the end of that long, empty table. The crushing silence of the house rushed back in. He was a ghost in this house of ghosts, bound by a bargain that had saved his family but cost him his soul. He sat there for a long time, watching the candle flicker, a prisoner in a fortress of wealth and sorrow. He thought this was his life now, a quiet, empty cage. He couldn't see the cracks already forming in her armor. He couldn't feel the ground beginning to shift beneath their two solitary worlds. He couldn't possibly know that the silence in this house was not empty. It was waiting. The days fell into a strange, silent pattern. Chayton would wake with the sun, a habit he couldn't break, and the house would still be asleep, wrapped in its cold quiet. He couldn't stand being inside that house. It felt like a trap. But the land was different. He would walk for hours, learning the shape of the hills, the sound of the wind in the cottonwoods by the creek, the high places where the hawks circled. It was her land, her property, but the wind and the sky belonged to no one. He rarely saw Eleanor before their silent, formal dinner. He knew she spent her days locked in her late husband's study. He'd catch glimpses of her through the open door, a small, determined woman bent over massive ledgers and maps. She was fighting a war of her own, he realized, a war of numbers and ink. Their evenings at the long dining table were a ritual of distance. The space between them was charged with everything they didn't say. He became a hunter again, but this time his prey was her. He studied her. He noticed the slight tremor in her hand when she lifted her glass. He saw the way her eyes would drift to the window, her gaze lost in the falling dusk. He learned her silences. He was still suspicious, still on his guard, but a sliver of curiosity had begun to work its way under his skin. Who was this woman, really? What was underneath the black dress and the fortress of polite reserve? He was about to find out. The first crack in the wall of silence wasn't made by a person. It was made by a horse. Her horse. A magnificent black stallion named Obsidian. A creature of fire and midnight silk, the last gift her husband had ever given her. One morning, Chayton saw the ranch hands leading the horse into the corral. Obsidian was limping badly, favoring his front leg. The foreman, a gruff man named Shaw, took one look and declared the horse ruined. A torn ligament, he said, fit for nothing but a bullet. Chayton saw Eleanor standing by the fence. Her face was pale, her hands clenched into fists. He saw a flash of raw, unguarded pain in her eyes. And in that moment, she wasn't the formidable Mrs. Vance. She was just a woman about to lose something she loved. Without thinking, he moved to her side. "Let me look at him," he said, his voice low. Shaw scoffed. "What's a reservation boy know about $1,000 horse?" Chayton ignored him. He kept his eyes on Eleanor. "My people have ways with horses. Our own medicine. Let me try." She studied his face for a long moment. Her gaze was searching, trying to see past the boy she'd bought, looking for the man inside. He met her gaze and didn't flinch. Maybe it was his quiet confidence. Maybe it was her own desperation. "Let him," she commanded, her voice sharp as broken glass. Shaw grumbled but stepped back. Chayton entered the corral. He didn't use ropes or force. He just stood still, letting the powerful animal feel his calm. He spoke to the horse in the old language, soft, murmuring sounds that were more like a prayer than a command. Slowly, patiently, he ran his hands over the horse's body, his touch light, searching. He found the heat, the swelling. Not on the leg, where Shaw had said. It was high on the shoulder, a deep muscle bruise, a painful injury but not a death sentence. Shaw had been wrong, but Chayton had a chilling thought. What if he wasn't just wrong? What if he had lied? For the next few days, Chayton worked on the stallion. He used hot poultices of herbs he gathered from the creek bed. He used a gentle, rhythmic massage his grandfather had taught him, working the pain out of the deep muscle. The ranch hands watched with open skepticism, whispering that the Indian boy was practicing witchcraft. Eleanor watched from the porch of the house. She said nothing. She just watched. A week later, Chayton led Obsidian from the corral. The limp was gone. The horse moved with its old grace and power, a living piece of the night sky. He walked the horse right up to the porch where Eleanor stood. He didn't say, "I told you so." He didn't say a word. He simply held the reins out to her. She walked down the steps. She took the leather straps from his hand, and her fingers brushed his. It was a fleeting touch, but it felt like a spark of lightning. She ran a hand down the stallion's gleaming neck, her eyes shining with unshed tears. Then she looked at Chayton, and for the first time, the mask was gone. In its place was a look of raw, unvarnished gratitude, and something else, something he'd never expected to see in her eyes: respect. "Thank you," she whispered. It was only 2 words, but they were the first real words that had ever passed between them. That evening at dinner, she didn't sit at the far end of the table. She told Martha to set a place for him right beside her. The chasm between them hadn't vanished, but it had just narrowed enough for a fragile bridge to begin to form. The bridge was built in the quiet moments. One night, with a full moon turning the prairie to silver, she asked him about the stars. He told her the story his grandfather told him of the great bear and the 7 hunters who chase it across the sky forever. He spoke in a low voice, and the vast, empty house seemed to hold its breath to listen. She watched his face, her own expression unreadable in the dim light. For a little while, she wasn't the powerful Mrs. Vance, and he wasn't the boy she had bought. They were just 2 people, sharing a story in the dark. Another time, he was sitting on the porch steps, carving a small wooden meadowlark, a gift from Mesa, to be sent with the weekly supply wagon. The wood shavings curled at his feet. Eleanor came out and sat on the railing just above him. She didn't ask what he was doing. She just watched. Her silence was different now. It wasn't heavy or uncomfortable. It was companionable. "I had a son," she said suddenly. Her voice was so soft he almost didn't hear it. He stopped carving. The tiny bird lay still in his hands. "His name was Walter," she said, her gaze fixed on the horizon. "He would have been 25 this year. He loved birds. He knew all their songs." Her voice broke, just for a second. "He died of a fever, when he was 7. Chayton didn't know what to say. The grief in her voice was a raw, living thing, a wound that decades had not been able to heal. He suddenly thought of the portraits in the hall. One of them was a serious-looking little boy in a velvet suit. Walter. And he understood. Her fortress wasn't built to keep the world out. It was built to hold her shattering grief in. He didn't offer empty words of comfort. He simply nodded, a small, silent acknowledgement of her pain. He looked down at the half-finished bird in his hand. It was enough. In that shared, unspoken sorrow, another stone was laid on their bridge. He realized this wasn't just a house of sadness. It was a shrine, and he was standing on holy ground. Then the blizzard came. It descended without warning, a swirling white fury that simply erased the world. The sky and the earth disappeared into a churning vortex of snow and wind. For 3 days, the ranch was an island, completely cut off. The wind howled like a grieving spirit, rattling the windows, piling drifts higher than the porch roof. They were trapped in the house together, just Chayton, Eleanor, and the silent Martha. The forced proximity dissolved the last of their formal distance. They worked together, side by side. They fought their way to the nearby barn to check on the livestock. They hauled firewood from the shed, their shoulders aching with the effort. When the pump froze solid, they melted snow for water. In the evenings, they huddled by the great stone fireplace, the only truly warm place in the drafty house. The storm stripped away everything but the essential. And it was during that storm that he finally began to see the woman beneath the widow's black dress. He saw her strength, her grit, her deep, unshakable love for this harsh land. She talked. For the first time, she really talked. She spoke of arriving here as a young bride from Philadelphia, terrified and lonely. She spoke of her late husband, and Chayton noticed she never spoke of him with love. She spoke of him with a weary resignation, hinting at a life that had been lonely and difficult long before his death. He found himself talking, too. Not about the hunger on the reservation, but about the good things. the way the light fell on the black hills at dawn, the smell of sage after a rain. He spoke of Mesa, of her cleverness and her bright laugh. He told her about his grandfather, the man who taught him about the horses and the stars. In the warm, flickering light of the fire, with the storm raging outside, they were no longer a transaction. They were just two people, stripped of their roles, sharing the fragile warmth of a fire and the deeper warmth of an unexpected connection. The snow that had imprisoned them had, in a strange way, set them free. When the storm finally broke, the sun shone on a world remade in glittering white. The silence that settled over the house was different. It was no longer the silence of distance. It was the silence of peace, of a quiet, shared understanding. But peace, in that hard country, was a fragile thing, and it was about to be shattered. The peace was shattered by the sight of a black speck crawling across the pristine snow. The afternoon stagecoach. It brought with it a threat far colder and more insidious than any blizzard. Patrick Donovan, the nephew of Eleanor's late husband. He had come from the East. He was a man whose ambition was written all over his face, in the greed of his eyes, and the cruel set of his mouth. He wore a fine city suit that looked ridiculous against the raw landscape, and he carried himself with an air of smug superiority. He strode into the house as if he already owned it, his eyes sweeping over the rustic furniture with open contempt. Then his eyes landed on Chayton, who was standing near the fireplace. They narrowed with a mixture of shock and pure disgust. "Aunt Eleanor," he said, his voice slick with false concern as he turned to her. "What is the meaning of this? The rumors in Blackwood are unsettling. I came at once." He gestured dismissively at Chayton, as if shooing away a stray dog. "They say you've taken up with a savage." "This is Chayton Vance," Eleanor said. Her voice was cold as ice, her posture ramrod straight. "My husband." Patrick let out a short, ugly laugh. "Husband? Aunt, you must be mad with grief. This is an outrage, a boy, an Indian. This marriage is a farce, a sham, and it will not stand. I am here to protect the family's interests, and your reputation." His real meaning was clear as day. He was there to protect his own inheritance. He saw Chayton not as a person, but as an obstacle. An insult to his family's name. A weakness in Eleanor's defenses that he could easily exploit. The fragile peace of the ranch was gone, replaced by a tense, ugly hostility that poisoned the very air. The days that followed were a quiet, brutal war. Patrick installed himself in a guest room, a toxic presence in the house. He made no secret of his intentions. He rode into Blackwood every day, spreading poison in the saloons and the general store. He painted a picture of a grieving, addled widow, bewitched by a cunning native. It was a story that found fertile ground in the town's deep-seated prejudice. At the dinner table, he spoke loudly of legal petitions, of competency hearings. His words were arrows, aimed directly at Eleanor. His presence forced Eleanor and Chayton into an unspoken alliance. They had to present a united front. When Patrick was watching, Chayton would stand a little closer to her, a silent, protective presence. She, in turn, would address him with a familiarity she had never used before, asking his opinion on ranch matters right in front of her nephew. It was a clear, deliberate display of respect, a performance. But by degrees, it became less of a performance. The shared threat forged their tentative connection into something stronger, something tempered by fire. They were no longer just two lonely people. They were partners, fighting a battle for her home, for her freedom. Patrick's cruelty had the exact opposite effect he intended. Instead of driving a wedge between them, it cemented them together. He tried to undermine Chayton with the ranch hands, calling him the squaw man or the widow's pet. But the hands had seen Chayton heal obsidian. They had seen his quiet competence, his deep knowledge of the land. They might not have understood the arrangement, but they respected skill. And they despised Patrick's city-bred arrogance. His insults only earned him sullen, hostile glares. The conflict finally boiled over one afternoon in the stables. Patrick, emboldened by whiskey, was berating one of the younger ranch hands. When Chayton calmly intervened, telling him to leave the boy alone, Patrick's carefully constructed mask of concern finally shattered. "You dare to give me orders?" he sneered, his face mottled with fury. "You, who are nothing but a piece of property she bought to spite us. You are not the master here. You are a dirty, red-skinned fraud." Chayton stood his ground. His face was a calm, unreadable mask, but his fists were clenched so tight his knuckles were white. He felt the old, hot anger rise in him, the same rage he had felt watching his people starve. But he also felt Eleanor's presence in his mind, the memory of her quiet strength. He would not give this man the satisfaction of a brawl. He would not sink to his level. "This is not your land, Donovan," Chayton said, his voice low and steady. "And I am not your problem. You are your own problem." Before Patrick could lunge at him, Eleanor appeared in the stable doorway. She must have heard the raised voices. Her eyes were cold and flinty, fixed on her nephew. "Patrick," she said, and her voice cut through the tension like a whip. "You will not speak to my husband that way. You are a guest in this house, a guest whose welcome is wearing dangerously thin. Go to town, sober up, and think very carefully about your next words." Defeated, humiliated in front of the men, Patrick stormed out, muttering threats under his breath. In the sudden quiet of the stable, Eleanor and Chayton looked at each other. He saw a fierce, protective fire in her eyes that he had never seen before. She had defended him. She had called him her husband. And for the first time, the word didn't sound like a legal term. It sounded like a shield. He knew then, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that Patrick would not give up. This was just the beginning. The real storm was still coming. The storm broke a week later. It didn't arrive with wind or snow. It arrived in a black carriage, kicking up dust in the late morning sun. Patrick Donovan stepped out, but he wasn't alone. With him were two men, the town sheriff, a man named Hale, whose spine was as flexible as his wallet, and a sharp-faced lawyer from Blackwood, clutching a leather satchel like it was a weapon. This was it, the formal assault. Eleanor met them at the door. Chayton stood just behind her, a silent shadow at her shoulder. She didn't invite them in, but they pushed past her into the great hall anyway, their presence a violation of the home's quiet dignity. "Eleanor, this is an intervention," Patrick began, his tone dripping with a loathsome, fake pity. "For your own good, I have here," he nodded to the lawyer, who opened his satchel, "a petition, signed by dozens of concerned citizens of Blackwood, and a legal motion to have you declared mentally incompetent to manage your own affairs." Sheriff Hale shuffled his feet, refusing to meet her eyes. "Ma'am, it's irregular. This marriage," he gestured vaguely toward Chayton. "People are talking. Patrick here has a legitimate family interest." "My interest is in seeing my uncle's legacy preserved." Patrick's voice rose, filling the hall. He turned his full, venomous attention to Chayton. "And you? You think you can waltz in here and take what belongs to decent, hard-working white folk? You think we'll let this charade stand? You are nothing. A savage she picked up from the gutter out of some pathetic, grief-stricken madness." Eleanor grew pale. Her hand gripped the back of a chair for support. The sheer public cruelty of it, the force of their greed, seemed to stun her into silence. For a terrifying second, Chayton thought she was going to break. He could see the lawyer preparing the papers for her to sign. He could see the smug look of victory in Patrick's eyes. They were going to steal her home, her life, right in front of him. And in that moment, something inside Chayton shifted. The boy who was sold for beef and blankets was gone. The quiet, stoic survivor was gone. In their place stood the man of this house, her husband. He took a single step forward, placing himself slightly in front of Eleanor, a human shield. He didn't look at Patrick or the lawyer. He looked directly at Sheriff Hale, the man who was supposed to represent the law, not the mob. He didn't raise his voice. He spoke with a quiet, profound stillness that commanded the room more than any shout ever could. "Sheriff," he said, "you speak of what is regular. Is it regular for a man to threaten a woman in her own home? Is it regular for greed to wear the mask of concern?" Then he turned his head and looked at Eleanor. He didn't see a frail, incompetent old woman. He saw the woman who had fought for this ranch, who had survived a difficult husband and buried her only child. The woman who had healed a broken horse with her hope and bridged the gulf between their worlds with quiet courage. "This woman," he said, his voice resonating with a deep, unwavering respect that silenced the room, "is stronger than any of you. This land knows her. She has put 30 years of her life into its soil. Her grief is not madness. It is a testament to a heart that has known great love and great loss. This is her home, and I am her husband. A promise was made. In my culture, a promise is a sacred thing. It has more weight than any paper you carry in that bag." His words hung in the air, simple, direct, and heavy with unshakable truth. He hadn't defended his own position. He had defended hers. He hadn't claimed any rights. He had affirmed her strength. Something in his quiet dignity, in the absolute sincerity of his voice, reached Eleanor. The paleness left her face, replaced by a flush of color. The tremor in her hand stilled. She drew herself up to her full height, and the formidable mistress of the V-bar-V returned, her eyes blazing with a cold fire. She stepped forward, taking her place beside Chaitin. She looked directly at Patrick, and the full force of her authority hit him like a physical blow. "Get out of my house," she said, her voice low and dangerously calm. "You speak of my husband's legacy. My husband built this ranch, yes, but I made it a home. I held it together while he raged. I buried my son on this land. This is my legacy, not his, and it is certainly not yours. You are a parasite, Patrick, a grasping, hateful little man." She then turned her fury on the sheriff. "And you should be ashamed. You have allowed yourself to be the tool of a bully. Now take him, and this ridiculous petition, and get off my property. If you ever set foot on V-bar-V land again without my express invitation, I will have you charged with trespassing. Do you understand me?" Her power was absolute, the authority of a queen in her own castle. The lawyer began to stammer, frantically stuffing his papers back into his satchel. Sheriff Hale, his face burning with shame, mumbled an apology and practically pushed the sputtering, enraged Patrick Donovan toward the door. They left. The heavy oak door closed behind them, shutting out the world. The sudden silence in the hall was vast and profound. The threat was gone. The battle was won. In the quiet aftermath, Chaitin and Eleanor stood side by side, not moving. The adrenaline slowly ebbed away, leaving something raw and new in its place. He turned to look at her, and she looked at him. The last of the walls between them, the last pretense of their arrangement, crumbled into dust. In her eyes, he saw not just gratitude, but a deep, resonant admiration. And in his, she saw not a boy or a bargain, but a man of honor who had stood for her when no one else would. Without a word, she reached out and placed her hand on his arm. The touch wasn't fleeting this time. It was a firm, solid connection, an anchor. They had faced the storm together, and they had held. In the weeks that followed the confrontation, the entire world seemed to shift. The quiet of the house was no longer the quiet of a tomb. It was the quiet of a sanctuary. The long, lonely dining table was abandoned. They took their meals in the warm kitchen or by the fireplace in the main hall. The silence that fell between them was no longer awkward or heavy. It was the comfortable, easy silence of two people who no longer need words to understand each other. The pretense of their arrangement had evaporated. In its place, something genuine and resilient had taken root. It wasn't the fiery passion of youth. It was something quieter, deeper, and far more enduring. A bond forged in shared solitude, tested by adversity, and solidified by a profound mutual respect. It was a strange and unexpected love, born from the most unlikely of soils. Chayton's role on the ranch was transformed. He was no longer a ghost haunting the edges of the property. He worked alongside the men, and his innate understanding of the land and the animals earned their unquestioning respect. He taught them his people's methods for tracking lost cattle, for reading the weather in the clouds. Eleanor, in turn, began to teach him her side of the world of ledgers and accounts, the business of buying and selling. She would sit with him in the study in the evenings, explaining the complex dance of numbers, her voice patient, her hand sometimes brushing his as she pointed to a column on a page. They were partners, in every sense of the word. The provisions for his family continued, but they were different now. Chayton managed the deliveries himself. It was no longer charity from a distant widow. It was support from a son and a brother. He rode back to the reservation regularly, and the sight of him, healthy and strong on a fine horse, brought a quiet pride to his father's eyes and a relieved joy to his mother's. Mesa's cough was gone, replaced by the bright, happy chatter of a healthy child. She would run to greet him, throwing her arms around his legs, the small wooden meadowlark he had carved for her clutched tight in her hand. One crisp autumn day, he asked Eleanor to ride with him. She hesitated for only a moment before agreeing. As they rode into the modest camp, a respectful quiet fell. His people didn't see the rich white woman, the rumored buyer of one of their own. They saw the woman who stood with Chayton, whose name was now linked with his. His mother came forward and offered Eleanor a cup of warm tea. It was a simple gesture of acceptance, but it spoke volumes. Eleanor accepted it with a quiet grace, her eyes meeting the older woman's in a moment of shared maternal understanding. They did not speak the same language, but in that moment they understood each other perfectly. Months turned into a year. The seasons turned, bringing a sense of healing and renewal. The harsh memory of the first winter faded, replaced by the quiet contentment of their shared life. They had built a home together, an unconventional fortress of two against a world that did not, and could not, understand them. They had found in each other a solace for their individual griefs, a balm for their loneliness. One evening, they stood on the porch, a familiar ritual now, watching the sky bruise into night over the rolling hills. The air was cool and smelled of pine and distant rain. "I never thought," Eleanor said, her voice soft in the twilight, "that I would feel peace in this house again. For so long, it was just a place of memory and obligation." She turned to him, and in the dim light he could see the lines of sorrow on her face had softened, smoothed away by a quiet happiness. "You brought life back into it, Chayton. You brought life back into me." He looked at her, at this strong, resilient woman who had offered a desperate bargain, and in turn had given him a future he could never have imagined. He had come to her as a sacrifice, a boy selling his freedom to feed his family. He had stayed as a partner, a protector, a husband. He had lost one home only to find another in the most unexpected of places. He reached out and took her hand, his fingers lacing through hers. Her hand felt small and warm in his. "We saved each other, Eleanor," he said. And it was the simple, unvarnished truth. They stood there together as the first stars pricked the deep velvet of the sky. Two people from two different worlds, bound by an unlikely love, their silhouettes merging into one against the vast, silent canvas of the American West. They had faced judgment and hatred and had answered it not with anger but with dignity and a quiet, unshakable loyalty. In a world determined to tear them apart, they had simply and bravely held on. What do you think happened to Patrick? Did he just give up, or is there another chapter to their story? Let me know in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like and subscribe for more tales of the unexpected.